Hi there, and welcome to another instalment of our Ramadan Conversations. The subtitle, We're All in This Together. True this year in many ways. The conversations are presented by the Affinity Intercultural Foundation of Australia. I'm John Cleary, and I'll be hosting this series presented throughout Ramadan. Yesterday, in our program, we visited Rome, and tonight we're back home with some notable Australians. Ramadan is of course characterised by the iftar meal, the breaking of bread amongst friends and neighbours. Last year, Affinity hosted some 45 house iftars and 10 institutional iftars, including up to 350 guests. This year, COVID-19 has made that impossible. So Affinity has decided to carry Ramadan to an online platform, a virtual iftar. Ramadan Conversations is a daily 1-hour live Ramadan conversation. Each episode will be live streamed and later you can upload it on Affinity's YouTube page. And as a former ABC broadcaster with a special interest in religion, it's my great pleasure to host these conversations together with a number of assistant hosts drawn from the Muslim community. They'll assist us. Tonight, we're joined by Dr Muhammed Aksu. Muhammed spent more than a decade as a secondary school teacher before moving into community work and is currently the director of Bluestar Intercultural Centre, a Canberra-based interfaith and intercultural dialogue organisation. Muhammad's PhD research centred on the changing representations of the Muslim community in Australian film and television. Well, Muhammed, good to see you again.
Thank you.
We're almost halfway through our conversations. It's been quite a year. How's it been for you and your friends? I mean, what sort of practical daily difference has it made? And just a little deeper, has it affected your feelings about your daily life?
Thanks, John. Just before I begin, I just wanted to say I don't know if we're being co-hosts or co-hindrances to you, so glad that you're bearing with us.
It's a great pleasure.
Thank you.
Couldn't do it without you.
Ramadan has been, as you said, very different, but I'm starting to realize, you find a way. You find a way to connect with your friends. As you said, Ramadan's generally a very busy time. You're hosting, you're doing things like that. But in the end, you always find a way to connect with other people. So we've been trying to do things online, virtual iftar. So we're having like virtual, what we're calling them is virtual Ramadan coffee dates, where we're getting Muslim and non-Muslim families to kind of have a chat with each other of an evening. One of our friends here in Canberra has initiated an iftar drop-off. So we're cooking for each other and dropping food off. So at least on that day, people are eating something that they haven't made themselves for iftar. It was really funny. We did it last week and we pulled up in front of somebody's house, 3 cars, and we just kind of offloaded food between the boots of all of our vehicles. It was like we were dropping off illegal goods or something. It was pretty funny. But deal was going down, and iftar dinner deal was going down. So you find a way. You find a way to stay. You find a way to stay connected, and I think we're still managing to do that. I think just being at home, you're able to put aside some time just for deep spirituality, for a lot of reading and reflection, which has been great. And a lot of the time you don't get to do that. Of a normal time, you come home, have something to eat, and then you might do some prayers. But a chance to pause and just think and contemplate. I think I've had that this year, and I haven't had that in a long time. So there are always blessings to be found, no matter what the situation is. So it's been different, but nice in its own way.
Well, Muhammed, it's time now to turn to our special guests. First tonight, it's the Honourable Ed Husic MP, Labor member for Chifley in Federal Parliament. Ed was raised in Western Sydney. He attended public schools and was among the first graduates from Western Sydney University. Since his election, since he was first elected in 2004, Ed quickly gained national attention as the first Muslim member of our national parliament. In the years since, he's held a number of positions within Labor's shadow cabinet, including employment services, the digital economy and the future of work. Prior to this, he also served as parliamentary secretary to the Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd. Ed Husic, welcome to this conversation.
Hi, John, and assalamu alaikum to everyone.
Alaikum
Dr.
salam.
Muhammed, how are
Hi,
you?
hi Ed. Good, thanks, Ed. How are you?
Very good, thank you.
That's great.
Ed, we've got a little digital delay here, so we'll ask our listeners and viewers to forgive that. But in the light of current discussions around opening the country up back again, there's now a discussion in many other countries about whether there should be a trade-off between public health and safety and economic growth. The discussion perhaps is most visible in the United States, but it's also becoming a factor in Australian discussions, including, for example, over education. Should it be so? Can you ever make such a trade-off?
I think it is very hard to make that trade-off, and the best step forward is to take into uh, serious consideration what the medical advice is, and if the medical advice says that we can start to resume the type of things that we all now are missing so badly, given the restrictions that have been imposed and the changes in our life, we're at that point, and I think it's the best way to go. The big danger here is in the absence of a vaccine, and there was some suggestion we might get it in 6 to 12 months, and now there's open discussion about whether or not this would even occur for 12 to 24 months. In the absence of that vaccine, it means that we are potentially vulnerable to second, third waves of coronavirus, and it does require us to think very carefully about how we start to slowly reintegrate those elements of life, as I said before, that we had taken advantage of previously, not really valued as much, but certainly do now. And so I think that's going to be the test. And a trade-off would be just awful. It's easy for us to say, but it's difficult for us to experience or contain that burden ourselves. If someone close to us is affected terribly as a result of a rush to lift restrictions in the face of medical advice, the people affected by that will feel it very keenly. And I guess I'm very conscious of that in responding to your question.
Yeah, I guess the danger is, particularly for politicians, professional politicians, that those arguments to and from can be so potent that the temptation is to use them as political weapons.
I think the public would judge very harshly those that would want to fly in the face of clear medical evidence that would ask us to just take a moment and think very carefully before we lift restrictions. And I think that's probably in many respects a safeguard. We have seen too, everyone has seen different parts of the world respond in various ways within their own borders. We've had, for example, across the Tasman, New Zealand moved quickly to shut down or to restrict movement for 4 weeks, and they have been able to withstand some of the worst effects of coronavirus as what we've seen in the US. But then others have pointed to or wondered whether or not Sweden, where it had sort of moved to embrace that concept of herd immunity, I should say, and that herd immunity, it was believed that if a lot of people were exposed, they would develop a resistance to coronavirus, and that would help society. But some of the figures that you see, if you compare to what Sweden did to what we did, are just horrific in terms of that smaller population, much larger group of people that were affected, and a very sizable number of people that lost their lives. And I think that type of consideration, coming to your question about politicians taking these things to an account, I think we have two things. We can look to New Zealand, we can look to Sweden, and we're all transfixed with what's happening in the United States right now, with a system that's not very unified or coherent, and people are trying to break out all over the place while infection rates are still climbing.
Yeah. You're the Shadow Minister for Human Services and the digital economy. This pandemic has seen a profound dislocation of economic life, not just the closure of businesses, but in the way businesses may be conducted in the future. People have discovered the online world in a new way, with IT-based companies such as Amazon making a potential killing, and even smaller corporations seeing outsourcing employee functions to home rather than the office as a benefit. Now, some workers are finding it convenient, and others finding that they are somehow the victims of some sort of corporate cost shifting. Do you think the general community, and in particular the Labor Party, are equipped for the coming battle over the nature of work, which some circles are calling for?
Well, let me start with this observation about work. I am very grateful, John, that you've maintained me in my former position of Shadow Minister. At this point, I'm in as I would tongue-in-cheek describe it, a professional hiatus. I hope at some point to return to the front bench, but
Wow, wishful
I
thinking.
await. Yes, indeed. But I think putting that aside, if we can put that aside for a moment, the heart of your question is really important for a number of things. One, if I can, just in the short term, when we right now, the way that we are talking with each other via video link in this way. These type of things weren't necessarily embraced, or there were very restricted instances where people would use these type of platforms. It was seen as too hard, too difficult. People wouldn't be able to relate to each other in this online setting, as opposed to the face-to-face context that we've often been used to, right? Well, that's all changed. And you've seen people now across Skype, Zoom, Microsoft Teams, this platform as well. We're holding the Ramadan Conversations here now in a way that we would never have necessarily thought previously. And, you then extend it not just to work meetings, but to schooling. My own son, through homeschooling, will watch videos that his teachers have made. He'll participate online and do his what he's would normally present to a class. I watched him earlier this week present via Google through Hangouts, and you would never have thought that necessarily would happen. And others have had to just learn very quickly about how to use digital tools in a way that they didn't have to contemplate. And I think coming out of this is going to make people think again about what they do. I have to say, for me, one of the biggest changes has been doing media interviews from my backyard as opposed to driving into a studio and having people comment sometimes favourably about the state of my garden or the poor state of a lemon tree that's not really faring well under my non-existent green thumb. But these are the changes we have to live with. So this has all changed the way that we're going to, behave into the future, I think. And in terms of the future itself, in terms of work, if you take into account what I just described, but also the fact that technology is changing the way that we are going to work, and that the big test will be on a range of other skills people are going to require longer term, because particularly in terms of manual work, dangerous work, repetitive work, technology through automation, artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotics, this is going to change things quite significantly. And you would have, John, seen this even yourself conducting this interview. Back in the day, you would have been potentially in a studio with cameramen, as it was generally the case. There would have been cameramen, audio specialists, producers around, and you're doing this from the comfort of where you are in a way previously not contemplated. We have to get ready for these changes. And I do sometimes wonder whether or not we're doing that quick enough, but maybe out of this, we're forced to think a lot more about that very issue.
Yeah. Your colleague, Christina Keneally, raised some eyebrows with her immigration speech this week. She suggesting a change to the nature of immigration into Australia after the pandemic has settled. But it was as much about the tone of what she said as it was the substance. I mean, some are suggesting there was an element of the dog whistle to blue-collar conservatives and even One Nation supporters. How did you view what she said?
Well, I have known Christina for a very long time and have worked with her on a number of issues, particularly recently in relation to confronting the threat of what's known as right-wing extremism. that affects a range of groups, not just people of many of which of the Islamic faith are gathered here tonight, but also the Jewish faith and others, where there have been really big concerns about the rise of right-wing extremism. And Christina has been someone I've worked with very closely in spotlighting that issue in the Australian context and urging Australian authorities to deal much more seriously with this threat. And it reflects within Christina a recognition that we are a stronger country if, from the diverse range of backgrounds, we work closer together. So while there might be some that would read into what she said, I know, for one, and I will personally vouch for the strength of her conviction and commitment to a diverse, strong, multicultural Australia. And some of the points that she raised were important to be raised. For example, the over-reliance on, for instance, temporary migration. We've brought in so many temporary migrants to do and perform work that we have not trained up our people for because we have neglected investment in education without getting too political. But one of the big things that has emerged out of this crisis is the number of temporary migrants who are not able to get support. So we relied on a lot of temporary migration to help us get work done. And at the moment, things turned bad. We turned our backs on those temporary migrants. And what Christina has said is we've got to rethink whether or not, in fact, I do agree that temporary migration is too high, that we should have a much more greater emphasis on permanent migration and ensuring that we have people that are committed to the long-term success of the country. And I think that is an important discussion to have. I am sure that there will be different ways we can put that forward, and I take on board some of the points that sit within your question. But I think there is a bigger argument, bigger discussion, a bigger focus to be had. And I think that's going to happen because migration is going to, by even the government's own accounts, drop by nearly 85% over the coming year, and that will have a big economic impact.
You were the first Muslim. Muhammad, please.
I just wanted to say, Ed, in times of crisis, when you have crises, a lot of the time, migrants or people outside of the country get pointed at as a source of the problem, as a reason for problems. I'm just hoping that, these things don't end up becoming like that. I understand what Christina is saying, but it seems to be, to me, more an issue around job security and the way that employees are being dealt with rather than a immigration thing. I think concentrating on it as a job issue would have probably dealt with some of those issues of dog whistling that John kind of said in his question. So I hope that isn't the case. In times of crisis, migrants and people who are not seen as being part of the country can cop it. And let's hope that isn't the case in this instance.
Look, I draw on my own personal background, my own family background with parents that migrated here in the 60s, and in particular my own dad who was a welder and brought here for specific skills that were in high need, given infrastructure projects at the time like the Snowy Mountains project, and was brought here in a way that he wasn't treated as a temporary guest worker, that was here for a specific time and moved on. He was here under a permanent migration system where he could bring his skills to employers that needed those skills. And, we were able to benefit. And as I've often remarked, there's not a day that goes past, Muhammad, that I'm not taking a moment to think how grateful I am that Australia allowed my family the chance to be here and for us to be able to contribute in this way. And I guess that's, if I can draw on that personal experience to say, with personal migration, there will be some people that will follow work and want to come to different countries to be able to participate in projects on a one-off basis. I see this a lot in the area of technology, where people will go from countries, particularly as they're young and they don't have necessarily family commitments to hold them down, and they'll want to chase experience and build up their own skills and, potentially make a big life for themselves. So there is some of that. But a lot of people do seek to be able to migrate and set up a new home. And we need to be able to, one, tap into those skills that they can bring, and to do it in a lot more stable way through a pathway of permanent migration. And the bigger thing too is we do need to invest more in schools, in TAFE, in apprenticeships, in universities. The whole emphasis that I mentioned earlier in response to one of John's questions around the future of work will require a change in our skill levels. And we can't, at a point when employers want people, just rely necessarily on bringing in more temporary migrants to fill those roles because we haven't invested in skills locally. So it's about finding the balance, but I take on board your point. We need to do it in a way that ensures that communities are feeling united, they're not divided, there's a lot of cohesion.
Ed, you were the first Muslim to be elected to federal parliament, and when you took the oath to be an MP, you did so by placing your hand on the Quran. It raised a few eyebrows, even one or two rumbles about the nature of the Constitution. But beyond those incidental moments and the occasional deliberate provocation offered by groups like One Nation, is Parliament proving to be an accommodating multi-faith arena?
Yes, it is. It absolutely is. I would say to you, without giving the, how can I put it, all the warm words and political speak, all I would say is encourage you to consider or remember when I gave a contribution in response to one senator's very forceful views about people of the Islamic faith just a few years ago. The response that I got from that speech that I gave within the Parliament and within the public was enormous. I was massively heartened by that because it said to me, in many respects, that a lot of people see no point in continually stoking fear and trying to split people apart. They want to find ways to get on, and they expect parliamentarians to encourage that. And I certainly got that feeling, not just from the broader public, but to your question when you asked about the Parliament itself, from within Parliament too. So I think there is that desire to make that make sure that we work in that way. And I've had friendships across from within, obviously, my own political party, but also across the political divide as well. We might have differences on issues from time to time, but I think there are a lot of people in the federal parliament that recognise the country stronger together rather than split.
How are you finding Ramadan this year? I mean, no iftars may have some health benefits, but the loss of community is certainly a significant one.
I had a sense, John, about where things were going when I thought about how our friends in the Christian faith were experiencing Easter, particularly on Good Friday and Easter Sunday. And I did post a note on Facebook saying to them that I understood how this was enormously, well, it was not just different for them, but it also posed challenges because people do like to get together in places of worship, particularly around Easter, for that very holy part of the calendar. And I instantly thought, because I knew Ramadan was around the corner, what it would be like for my friends in the Muslim community, particularly in my local area, where they love to be able to gather and mark the start of Ramadan, and also to be able to share each other's company in iftar as well. So I had a sense of how different this would be, but it is very difficult. I absolutely loved hearing what Muhammad was saying about the iftar drop-offs. Someone needs a Nobel Peace Prize for that concept. I thought that was really good. But I always do enjoy Ramadan, and I enjoy fasting, as a lot of Muslims will tell you, John. It is not just, I mean, physically you feel different. I feel, when I get up early in the morning and you finish, you make your commitment not to eat through the day. You're very productive early in the morning. Sure, there are those, as Muhammad sure knows, and a lot of other would know, there's that fuzzy period in the afternoon, close to iftar, where I make sure I'm not doing too many media interviews or serious calls.
That's called siesta.
But
We're familiar with that.
and yes, indeed. And you do feel good. You feel a sense that, I mean, I always grew up. One of the biggest things that was impressed upon me was there was a time to remember those who don't necessarily have the benefit of things that you take for granted, to remember the importance of sacrifice and self-discipline. And, I get a lot out of, as many Muslims do, going through Ramadan.
Ed, I know you're a big basketball and Chicago Bulls fan, and we're talking about
Hmm.
not being able to do Ramadan well, and we don't have any sport. So I just wanted to know the impact of not having sport. Not just at a professional level, but at down to those local clubs. What kind of social impact is this having at the community level? Especially in those lower socioeconomic areas. Sport for many can be a
Mm.
real pathway into wider society. What do you think this means to families at large?
I think it's putting huge pressure on sporting clubs, and those sporting clubs, as you rightly reflect in your question, are magnets for community life. They bring people together. They make neighbourhood life and the quality of it so much better. They provide an important outlet for kids to develop, for them to keep fit, and also for people that aren't necessarily young anymore, either through volunteering or participating in sport themselves. And I think again, when we've touched a number of times on the fact that this has changed the way we live our lives, this is another one of those instances where this does have a potential impact on community life. And I think there will be a lot of people keen to resume sport if they can sometime down the track. It is something I've thought a lot about. I've wondered how that will happen because, again, the trickiest thing is the absence of a vaccine, and being able to ensure that people in high risk, potentially high risk groups, are shielded from that risk or have that risk reduced around them. So it is a big issue, and I know a number of young people as well have been very keen, had been keen to participate in sporting competitions for national selection, and had that cancelled at the last minute. And I could just imagine how terrible that would have been for them. And this is a big issue, and I think it's one that we're going to need to think carefully about in terms of trying to bring it back, but bring it back safely.
And one last thing, Ed, have you been watching The Last Dance on Netflix?
Oh yeah, I didn't. In fact, I
It's
got asked
amazing, isn't it?
very embarrassed. It is really good having. I suspect we all had the opportunity in younger days to watch that team, the Chicago Bulls, perform,
Yes, yes,
and
yes.
I have read a lot of that history that is now being detailed in that Netflix series, The Last Dance, and but to see it, out of people's own mouths, what they've been saying is something else. I got caught. Uh, I got caught a few weeks ago when because it was released at about the same time Malcolm Turnbull released his autobiography, and I was asked if I'd watched one of his interviews on the 7:30 report, and I had to confess on air that no, I'm sorry, Lee Sales and Malcolm Turnbull. I was too busy watching the Netflix series.
Well,
That's
for
understandable.
those
I
who
think that's understandable.
yeah, for those who like me, my career in basketball ended as a 14-year-old when I got the tried hardest award for the season. But this is the Michael Jackson series we're talking about.
Yeah, yeah,
Michael
The Michael
Jordan, I
Jordan
should
series.
say.
Yeah,
See, there you go.
yeah.
I didn't want to
Ed
correct
Husic,
you,
great to
John.
talk to you. Yeah, great to talk to you. Thanks so much for joining us. You're with Ramadan Conversations, and time now for a piece of music. And perhaps you can introduce Sali to us, Muhammad.
So Salih Rashid Olu is a Sufi music producer and player, and I think his group with his friends, especially in Ramadan, tour different parts of the country and play their soothing music for different audiences. And I think it'll be a wonderful piece, and let's enjoy.
Hello once again. Tonight I will play Ilahi from Hijaz Maqam, which is in Hijaz scale. Ilahi itself called I fell in love in the garden of heaven in Medina. So I hope you enjoy it.
Sali, thank you for that. Beautiful performance of Sufi tradition, music from the Sufi tradition. Well, Muhammad, it's time to turn to our next special guest. And joining us tonight is Maha Abdo. Maha is a holder of the Order of Australia. She's spent over 3 decades working together with the Muslim Women's Association to help give Muslim women safety in difficult circumstances. Today, she represents and gives voice to women abroad as well as in Australia, working at local, national and international levels, advising governments on policy for future generations of Muslim and non-women. In 2016, Maha was the New South Wales Seniors Week Ambassador as well as the Breast Screen New South Wales Ambassador. In 2015, Maha was a finalist for the Australian Human Rights Commission Human Rights Medal. And in 2014, she was the New South Wales Human Rights Ambassador for that year. Maha, welcome to this Ramadan Conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Maha, over the years, I've come to know you and your work. You've proved a tireless advocate and worker. Has being at home this year allowed you to have a more reflective Ramadan? And have there been losses and gains as well?
I think, yes, subhanAllah, it's amazing. You think you've got plenty of time to sit and reflect, but having all these Zoom meetings and WebEx meetings and all of that, it just sort of, you can't apologize for meetings. But by the same token, I think it's 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 given time out that you can actually reconnect spiritually with with our Creator, Allah Subhanahu wa Taala, and I think it's while there's so much unknown and things going on, and with the work that we do in supporting a lot of vulnerable communities, I think that in itself is always in the back of my mind. But at the same time, I do get the chance to have my own time at night time, where normally we're just visiting and running around and doing all sorts of things and going from one iftar to another. Yeah, it is time out.
Now, you're the founder of the Muslim Women's Association. It's now in its 35th year. What were the initial aims, and how much has changed? And has your direction changed, or the thrust of anything changed over those years?
Well, as an organisation, it started with few women from the Lebanese community and some of the Turkish community. So I got together to set up an organisation just to sort of help support women in the settlement process, and it started as just to sort of do some English classes and, some social activities. And over the years, as we've moved and we've grown, the social issues that have been, surfaced, have been of concern. So as an organisation, we've tackled them and we've tried as much as possible to deal with those. So we started off, specifically as a Muslim women organisation, catering for Muslim women of all ethnic background, and it's non-sectarian. And now, just in the last 4 or 5 years, we've become of course we are a Muslim women organisation, but catering for women and children and men and families of all background, all faith and no faith. And I think that's a growth in itself. And only in early March this year, we became Muslim Women Australia. So I think that's a big growth.
Maha, the past Monday, May the 4th, was the 47th anniversary of Gough Whitlam signing a law to lift the age restrictions on women working in the public service. It was seen as the first step in a movement towards equality in Australian workforces. What challenges continue to exist in this regard?
For women?
Yes, for women, yes.
Yeah. I think that challenges continue for mainstream women, but there are many intersectionalities for all women where we have to continuously deal with, gender issues, ethnic, certain age discrimination, race, so there are multi-layers and of intersectionalities that women have to deal with in the workforce. But if we measure it from now between this time now and the 70s, when Gough Whitlam lifted that, I think is a big change. And women are at the forefront. Women are taking leading roles in making decisions, in creating, policies and influencing policies. So there's been so much leeway and moving forward, but I think there's always more to come. But I really look at it from a perspective of both men and women complement each other, and it's not one against the other. And I think that's where the power lies, is that when we work to complement one another, not the fact that one is better or should be ahead of the other.
Let's turn to one of the concerns at the moment, in the background of this COVID-19 pandemic. Have the challenges for Muslim and non-Muslim women changed during this lockdown period? I'm thinking particularly about family stress and even domestic violence.
Of course. Look, just earlier this afternoon, I was on a Zoom meeting with women from all agencies around Australia, looking at just discussing some of the issues and concerns. Of course, the being locked, we call it locked down, and being sort of restricted in your movement and accessing, the outside world is something of concern at the moment. We have not seen a spike in the reporting or in women accessing services, but what we're hearing is that there's a lot of frustration and a lot of confusion. There's so much going on, and it's on both sides, both men and women, because when they're all together, there's no outlet. There's no sort of, even with children, we are concerned about children being in families where it's not safe. So there are many challenges at the moment for families, and what we're trying to utilize as much as we can platforms on social media, using WhatsApp, all of that. On a daily basis, we have a team of communication team volunteers who send out messages just sort of to put that sort of peace and tranquility in people's hearts. And if they need to access any services, they're okay to sort of call and find, access, just someone to sort of help them, find peace in the place that they're in. And if they're in danger, what they should do. And I think the elderly as well. I think, older people are of concern, especially older women who are now feeling isolated. So there's multi-layers of concerns for us at the moment.
Maha, you're a campaigner for human rights, and there have been instances of racism towards Asian Australians, at this time in regards to COVID. It's very frustrating to see these things, in these difficult times. What do you think needs to continue to happen to counter the spread of these sentiments and these things?
Well, I think racism has no colour, no creed, and no, at the moment it's taking place against our Asian, Chinese friends, and it's no different than when the Muslim community gets to be attacked. So I think we've just got to create a space where we come together and we collectively work together to highlight what are some of the concerns, so that we create space for awareness, understanding, and not just shutting down other people's views and concerns, but blatant racism and discrimination. I think it's an issue for all of us, especially bystanders, to be able to understand and learn how to amicably respond to it, rather than respond with a force, with an iron fist, if you know what I'm saying. So I'm from the belief that if there are issues and there are racist remarks and comments and all of that, is to try as much as possible to use peaceful retractions and peaceful interactions, so that we can mend the heart and change, hopefully, people's attitudes. And attitudinal change can only happen when we collectively to do that.
Maha, Abdo, it's been great of you to join us tonight. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Well, Muhammad, while you're taking a quick sip of water, let me introduce our next guest. Our final guest tonight is Stephen Blanks. Stephen's an executive committee member and former president of the New South Wales Council for Civil Liberties. He's been an active campaigner for human rights, particularly the rights to free speech and privacy and the rights of asylum seekers. Stephen is also a principal of SBA Lawyers based in Rozelle in Sydney. He's a member of the New South Wales Law Society Privacy and Data Committee and a member of the Human Research Ethics Committee for Red Cross Lifeblood. Stephen Blanks, good to have you with us.
G'day, John. Very nice to be here. And Dr Muhammed.
Good evening. Stephen, as the former president of the New South Wales Council for Civil Liberties, can you just give us a brief introduction to the nature and the purpose of the council?
Sure. The council has got a long and glorious history. It was founded in 1963 in response to what must have been very typical of that time, the police raiding a party in King's Cross and behaving disgracefully, particularly against some homosexuals at the party. The police refused to identify themselves and were quite aggressive. And in response to that, unfortunately, unfortunately for the police, some of the people at that party were academics and lawyers who decided that action really needed to be taken to address that problem, and the council was founded. And there were three primary areas of interest reflecting the situation in the 1960s. Police misbehaviour was one. Censorship, which was around in the 1960s in a very heavy-handed way, was a second area. And immigration non-discrimination was the third area that they were interested in. And from that beginning, the council has operated continuously for now nearly 60 years.
It's interesting, Stephen, that the last couple of months and the pandemic and the government's responses to it have begun to raise a series of questions in this area. Now, there are myriad questions from the trivial to the cynical in this area, but are there some serious questions emerging regarding civil liberties in this context?
It's a very serious situation where the most severe imaginable restrictions on freedom are imposed on the community. You are not allowed to leave your own residence except with a reasonable excuse. Now, that was in operation for nearly 6 weeks. And that's extraordinary. It's still an operation with slight variation, but it's an extraordinary restriction on the most fundamental freedom. That is, you can go wherever you want freely to go about your business. And to be exposed to the police questioning you about whether you've got a proper excuse to leave your house is exposing you to, or exposing the community to harassment by the police and discrimination. And so the civil liberties concerns about the response are serious. But at the end of the day, the pandemic is a greater threat to the community. The restrictions on freedom are temporary. So long as the police behave responsibly, the community is supporting the current restrictions. And at the end of the day, it's community support that makes these restrictions acceptable. If we've always said that if the police overreach, if these restrictions are not subject to proper oversight, if they're not brought to an end as soon as it's possible to do so, then there will be serious problems. And so it's important for the community to understand the principles which result in these restrictions and how they're to be brought to an end. And that, but it's amazing that in the Australian community we've had such broad support for these serious restrictions.
It's interesting to see these issues in high relief in other countries like the USA, where demands that the country be opened up are hijacked by far-right libertarian and even fascist elements. How do you feel about the appropriation of civil liberties agendas in this fashion, and do we see any evidence of it in Australia?
I haven't seen any evidence of the hijacking of the civil liberties movement by right-wing extremists. What is going on in the US at one level is just completely inexplicable. To me, at least, it's the it's a symptom of the complete absence of a concept of society across the American community. That no one very few people in America, an insufficient number of people in America, seem to think of themselves as part of a community dependent upon each other. And so their own individual rights and freedoms are always paramount to the community's interests. And of course, it's possible to go to the other extreme. And you look at China, where people willingly, it seems, accept that they must subordinate their own personal freedoms to the community interest in extraordinary ways, not just through this pandemic, but more generally across society. Australia, we have the luxury of a free society and traditions of freedom without the extreme individualism that we've seen in the US. And I just think we can thank our lucky stars that we live in such a great community.
So coming back to a local version of that debate, what are your thoughts on the COVID-safe mobile phone app? If it is as important as it is claimed, why hasn't it been made compulsory for each Australian to download and to use?
Well, it would be an extreme infringement on individual rights to make an app which could breach privacy compulsory. And one of the things we've always said about this app is that it must remain voluntary, and the community should not feel pressured or compelled to download it. So that quite properly, it is illegal and with serious criminal penalties for an employer to require an employee to download the app. It is illegal for a restaurant to require a patron to have the app. And it is, the app does raise some serious issues, not all of which have been answered yet. The source code for the app still isn't released, so that we still can't have review of it by technically competent people to make sure that it does what it says, what the government says it does, and no more. And it does it in a safe way. Again, there are some important principles around the design of this app which are necessary to keep in mind. That you should be able to delete it after you've downloaded it. Deletion of it should result in deletion of all records. That's not quite the case, but it should render it unusable from then on. And the people who have access to the information from the app has to be restricted strictly to those people who are administering the pandemic response. And the temptation with these data gathering apps is always there are going to be more people who say it would just be fantastic if we could have access to the data. Police, obviously, the courts, family law proceedings, social researchers. You can just see the potential for a whole range of people to say there'd be a really good benefit for us having access to the data, and those temptations have to be ruled out, and people have to have confidence that there is not going to be function creep, that this app is only going to be used for the stated purpose and not later developed into something else.
So have you downloaded it, Stephen?
Look, I have, and that might seem surprising, but partly in preparation for interviews about it in the media. I didn't want to be in a position of saying I'm so oppositional that I haven't downloaded it, partly because my own particular family circumstances are that we have a vulnerable member of our family, and so we are thinking very carefully about the measures that we take to ensure safety within the home. And it was after a family discussion we decided that we would all download it.
I have too. I must say, confess that I've got my app on my phone. So these questions, you do weigh about, you fret them through, but no, I've come down on the same side as you for the moment. Muhammad, should we ask you or not?
I haven't. I'm going to be truthful. It's probably just laziness. I just haven't got around to doing it. So, yeah, I don't know. I've got all those other apps on my phone, so everybody knows where I am. When I'm talking with my wife, some ad pops up, which describes exactly what we were talking about. You know, we're talking about a bike or something, and you get all these bike ads popping up. So, yeah, I think my personal freedom is being impinged on anyway. So I'm not that worried about it. But I don't know, it's just laziness, I think, at the moment.
Earlier this week, Stephen, we discussed media freedom. To what extent should we in Australia be concerned about this issue at the moment? And it's not just the influence of social media, but of course, local newspapers closing down and the threats to media from some of the security legislation being passed.
I think we have some serious concerns about the media, and unfortunately, the media themselves are not necessarily completely reliable in the angles that they pursue in reporting it. But plainly, we have police overreach in terms of willingness to surveil journalists, to get metadata from phones of journalists to see who's been contacting them, to execute search warrants at the homes of journalists and at the offices of media organisations in relation to stories which expose government wrongdoing. Now, the very purpose of a free media is to expose government wrongdoing. And when the government can use its own agencies to intimidate, suppress, repress media from reporting just because they're reporting on sensitive areas involving potentially national security, it's not justifiable. And the position of the free media in Australia has never been more tenuous than it is now, and it's exacerbated by the concentration of ownership and the transition from a economic model which was successfully able to fund good journalism at scale, and now the source of revenue for that has been evaporating, and so the media are under commercial pressure. It's interesting to see the battle that Google and Facebook are waging against the latest government measures to try and recoup some revenue which has gone their way. On this occasion, I think the government needs to be absolutely firm. Foreign organisations which pay little tax in Australia but have captured the lion's share of the advertising revenue which used to be used to support media is a serious issue and needs to be pursued.
A whole other discussion. Muhammad, perhaps we should leave the last word to you on this one.
Over the years, you've attended Affinity iftar dinners. What contribution do you believe these iftar dinners have to the wider society, Stephen?
Well, for me personally, it's been a privilege to attend iftar dinners, to meet people that I wouldn't otherwise get to meet, to form friendships, and to learn about other cultures. And that's one of the things which I find most impressive about Affinity and the iftar dinner tradition, that it expands people's minds and networks and knowledge of different cultures and different things. And I think just from that point of view alone, it's a fabulous experience.
Stephen Blanks, thanks so much for your time tonight.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks, John. Thanks, Muhammed.
Well, Muhammed, that's just about all we have time for this evening. Thanks for being part of the team. Any observations as we say goodnight?
Once again, a wonderful group of guests we had. I think it was a great discussion as always, and excellent.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see how these discussions, most people in the community, they're all issues that touch them one way or another. And when you get a chance to sort of sit back for a while, and instead of having to speak in short, 20-second bites, a chance to reflect, they're all issues that touch on most of us.
Definitely.
Well, thanks for joining us tonight. Thank you at home particularly for joining us tonight. Our next episode will be tomorrow. Over the past week, our conversations have featured a number of well-known guests, and if you wish to view this or any of the series of Ramadan Conversations, you can find them on the Affinity YouTube channel. Stay safe. Have a blessed Ramadan.